So on Patreon, I ran a poll about which topic I was going to discuss, and this went out. If you're interested in joining us on Patreon and contributing to future polls, that would be awesome. I'd really appreciate it. And you also get access to our Discord server where I also run polls and we discuss interesting things. But anyways, the Chosen One and the motif of the Chosen One is a very common theme in mythology and even our modern stories, wherein there is something special about the protagonist which marks them off for a particular destiny, and it's what calls them to their hero's journey. There are various ways in which this theme plays out. For example, in Harry Potter, who is chosen by, I guess, prophecy and fate to be the particular person who defeats Voldemort. Or Paul Atreides, who is specifically bred to be a superhuman, and so he has these special powers which distinguish him from the average person. Or Frodo, who is appointed by other people to a very specific task, and is deemed the only person capable of fulfilling said task. In older myths, there is usually a sense of divinity surrounding the protagonist, and this contributes to the fact that they're the chosen one. A heavenly authority often chooses a person to be the one, and this is sometimes a function of their birth status. And even kings will pretty much assert that their authority comes from heaven, and God has specifically selected them to be the king, even though this is, more of a way to legitimize their authority. But very commonly, the hero has special powers, which are a mark of their distinction from the ordinary man. Jesus is the chosen Messiah because he's literally the son of a god. Many heroes are in fact either gods or sons of gods, demigods, or living incarnations of gods, who are cast midway between gods and humans. For instance, Hercules was the son of Zeus, but born to a mortal mother. Krishna was a god, but he was also raised by mortal parents, which is a very similar theme. And so in many heroes, there's this attempt to kind of combine or, cast the hero as being strewn between these two opposing forces of heaven and earth, of divine and mortal. And being kind of pulled by these two opposing forces is highly significant for psychology. Because remember, mythology and stories are a product of the human psyche. They come out of the human psyche, and so there's a sense in which understanding these stories sheds light upon the human psyche. But being kind of, cast amid these two opposing poles is very characteristic of how the ego feels, and how it kind of arises amidst the broader context of being a human being. Humans are not merely products of nature, but we're also products of a kind of divine culture. By divine, I mean more in the realm of the imaginary, of things which aren't necessarily real, like laws and culture and cultural expectations. But this is how we're kind of able to go beyond our instincts and be more than merely human. So while the idea of the chosen one seems pretty unremarkable and straightforward, it does appear in like every story, there are certain elements of this trope which correspond to the psychological situation of having an ego and being an individual, and these are worth analyzing. And in fact, they point to the idea that you, in a sense, are the chosen one. Yes, you, watching this video right now, you are the chosen one. And there's a sense in which, obviously, this is a philosophical point, but there's a sense in which it is like the inevitable conclusion of having an ego. You are the chosen one because you are the only person who will ever be you. The reason the chosen one motif appears is because of the fact that when we are born, we're originally in this state of like mystical participation with the world around us. We're in this non-individuated state where we more or less blend in with our surroundings, and we're a vessel of the people around us. We haven't yet gained any measure of psychological autonomy. And so we more or less just go with the flow of the people around us. Like we're intertwined with their psyches. It's like we're in this dream state. And if you actually try to think back to what that was like, it's very hard to grasp. Because in that state, you never realize, the sheer perplexity of being. You never realize that you exist. And in this state, you don't feel like an individual entity. The world just kind of exists and you go along with it. That is until you realize something. You suddenly realize that you are a specific person, and that you are distinct from people out there. Kids at this stage will begin to use the word I a lot because, again, they're putting up a psychological barrier between themselves and the world out there. And this is where you begin to make the distinction between things which constitute me and things which are not me. And you also begin to develop a conscious representation of you. But again, you don't just develop this representation, you begin to identify with it. You begin to think that you are this representation. And this is tied to the chosen one motif because being the chosen one is exactly how the ego feels. And this is how you feel once you begin to develop an ego. You feel disconnected from the world out there, and you feel distinct from the world. You feel marked off, so to speak. And this is why you feel special and distinct. And you begin to feel yourself as a special, unique individual. You begin to realize that you have your own internal world and thoughts and experiences, which you can't easily transmit to other people. You can only experience them experience them directly from your own vantage point. And this is why we begin to overinflate our own egos, because you understand the infinite complexity of yourself. Whereas other people out there, you can't see their perspectives, and so from your perspective, it looks like they're rather simple and ordinary. And again, they only seem like this to you because you can't access their thoughts and their experiences. You can only access your own inner realm. So your own inner realm becomes magnified, whereas the perspective of other people, it seems kind of, simplified. Obviously, from their perspectives, they're thinking the same thing, though. It's funny because I remember distinctly as a kid thinking that, I was way more interesting than other people. But the only reason I thought this is because I really only understood myself. And so my complexity and my interestingness was apparent to me, but, it was difficult for me to grasp other people's complexity because I couldn't see the world through their vantage point. The chosen one motif is a mythological expression of the alienating experience of having an ego, of being a distinct person from the rest of the world. You begin to feel like you're this special, unique being because, again, you are you and not someone else. I remember as a kid, as my ego was developing, I asked myself this all the time. I wondered, why was I me and not someone else? Why was I thrown particularly into this body? Why wasn't I born in a different country or in a different time period? Why wasn't I born 100 years in the future? Also, why wasn't I an animal? Why was I a human? And no, you aren't someone else. You are only you. And as far as you can tell, you're the only person you will ever be, unless reincarnation is a thing. But importantly, you're the only person who will grasp and truly understand your own complexity. You can intimately know yourself because, again, you're directly connected to your psyche, so you can experience your own mind directly. Now, of course, anybody who's familiar with the psychology of the unconscious would realize that the ego has a very limited scope, and so there's a sense in which you won't be able to fully comprehend yourself. There will always be parts of your personality that kind of remain in the dark, but nevertheless, you can understand yourself to a much greater degree than you can probably understand other people. And again, this is why the ego feels like it's the chosen one, because it must approach the world from a very particular vantage point, and you are bound to this vantage point. You can't experience life from a different vantage point, you can only experience it from your own. This fact is almost like solipsism. And there's a kind of wisdom in solipsism, even if it isn't necessarily true, because logically speaking, the only thing that you definitely can confirm exists is your own mind. You can't confirm the existence of other people's mind. You can infer it. If you're purely logical, which isn't always the best way to think, you would conclude that the only thing that really exists is your own mind. And so, of course, your own ego becomes magnified in this way. Now, that explains a lot of the symbolism that we see in myths and its relationship to psychology. And you can see why the mythological chosen one characterizes the ego so well. But I wanted to talk about this a lot further and, again, incorporate the notion of being the chosen one into our daily lives. Because even though you probably experienced the sense of specialness and distinction from the world out there when you were a kid, there's a good chance that perhaps out of humility or low self-esteem that you don't regard yourself as particularly remarkable right now. And I think this makes sense because, people who are highly egoistic and, full of themselves and have this grandiose self-image, they can be quite off-putting, especially if they're unaware of their own shadows. The concept they hold of themselves doesn't reflect reality. There are a lot of people who haven't come to terms with their own shadow and have these hyperinflated egos, and their self-concept doesn't actually correspond to reality. And so, perhaps in an attempt to avoid being like that, we undervalue our own egos. But the opposite attitude to that egoistic kind of mentality, I don't think is particularly healthy, because not thinking of yourself as special and unique is arguably more dangerous in the long term. There should be a healthy balance between having high self-esteem and kind of recognizing your own shortcomings and your own shadow. And what I'm about to say should probably be a longer discussion, but people who are very authoritarian and are very controlling are usually very egoistic and think of themselves as like messiah figures. They think of themselves in a superior manner relative to other people. And they can be so blinded by their own, self-image that they completely disregard the existence of other people and treat them almost like they're pawns in a game of chess. This is why authoritarian leaders can just send people to war and have their own soldiers die and kill so many people, because they just disregard the lives of their victims because they don't view them as particularly valuable. They see their own self and their own ego as superior and in a supreme position relative to other people. And so you may be thinking, shouldn't we dissuade egoism? Shouldn't we stop people from trying to have this grand sense of self? And the answer is actually no, because the reason authoritarians come to power is because they're surrounded by people who are de-individualized, who don't have their own autonomy, and who don't value their egos particularly highly. Authoritarians come to power when we lack heroic individuals who are strong enough to stand up to them. Authoritarians thrive in environments where people are de-individualized, where they feel like they're statistics rather than people, where they feel like they're, cogs in a machine. So really the solution to this problem is encouraging people to become more individuated. This serves as a bulwark against authoritarians. The best society, in my opinion, is one where more people are highly individualized rather than being de-individualized. Because it's amidst the backdrop of the latter where the most evil people are able to rise up, seize power, and inflict significant harm. In other words, I'm encouraging you to be a hero. But what is a hero from a psychological perspective? The hero is one who attempts to assert their own agency in a world that can often feel like it's completely random and out of our control. That's how the universe often feels. It feels like you're just thrust into a random point in history and you just are powerless against a universe that has this almost predetermined will and this predetermined trajectory. It feels like so much is out of our hands. For example, where you were born will play a significant role in how your life turns out. Who your parents were is another example of that. And so much feels like it's completely out of our control and it's just like kind of like a dice roll. So your ego, feels this. It feels this powerlessness against the universe. But because it's feeling this way, the heroic drive that the ego possesses attempts to go its own way. It attempts to subvert the kind of predetermined trajectory of the universe and assert its own autonomy. It doesn't want to be confined, to the will of other people or to the will of your circumstances. It doesn't want to surrender to the universe. It wants to fight against the universe in a heroic struggle in order to assert its own free will. There's a sense in which consciousness and the ego is the only thing that's capable of free will. And I think this does make a lot of sense. I don't think it's the only thing capable of free will, to be honest. But I do feel that one's conscious mind is able to exert a high degree of free will in order to overcome one's circumstances. I'll take me as an example. I'm genetically predisposed for heart disease. And I know this is a fact. And, that feels like it's something out of my control. Obviously, I can't choose my genes. I can't go back and change my genes. So again, this feels like a fact that the universe just kind of dealt me this hand and I have to deal with it. But knowing this fact, the heroic side of me wants to struggle against it. So I can take actions in my life to prevent this from being my outcome. I can eat healthier, I can exercise more, and by doing this, I struggle against the way the universe seemed to be preset. And again, I can strive to live a healthy and optimal life this way. And this is the attitude the ego needs to take. It needs to have a sense of power. Because psychology experiment after psychology experiment reveals that people with a high locus of control have much better psychological outcomes. People with a low locus of control, i.e. people who feel helpless, tend to have worse outcomes, and they don't even have the ability to kind of overcome the circumstances that the world has imposed upon them. If your circumstances suck, if you have a debilitating disease, for example, or if your parents were neglectful and abusive, you have been dealt a bad hand. But letting yourself kind of sulk in those circumstances and acting like you can't control them and that there's nothing you can do will only make your situation worse. You need to be a hero. You need to strive against the world. It's good for you, and it's probably good for everyone else as well. And this comes back to the idea that you are the chosen one, because in a way, you are the chosen one. You watching this video right now are the only person who will experience it from your particular vantage point, and you will only ever be you. So when I speak to your ego, you have to understand that your ego has an immense amount of control over your body, over your psyche, and over the world around you. And this is a very important psychological principle, actually. The ego can struggle against the world. But to do so, it first must struggle against the self. The first inertia that a person feels when their ego wants to kind of assert itself is the inertia which comes from the unconscious psyche. Your unconscious mind has drives and impulses which resist your kind of higher intentions that arise from the ego. And so in your battle against the universe and its kind of predetermined will, the first and most important struggle that you need to win is the struggle against yourself. Your ego is immensely powerful and it can command your body to do rather remarkable things. But oftentimes the ego is too weak to actually overcome the unconscious psyche. In fact, this is the goal of psychotherapy. We try to dig into the unconscious of a particular person in order to find what in the unconscious is impeding them and impeding their ego from kind of, moving on. But to get back to my point, the ego is absurdly powerful. This is a very powerful thing which each of us possesses. The ego can cause you to be courageous when you're experiencing fear, for example. So if you're prone to panic, your ego can react calmly in that situation, cut through your emotions in order for you to still be effective. So imagine being a soldier and you're in war and you're in a very stressful and panic-inducing situation. It's your ego, your higher ego, which can cut through all of that and maintain a level of poise and stability, even in a panic-inducing situation. And so really, it can exert a very almost like godlike amount of power. And again, this relates to that symbolism of the ego and of the hero being a divine figure, because the ego is this divine figure. It's able to accomplish feats which seem almost supernatural. And another thing to realize is that, even if you can't control the world out there as much as you would like, you can control the world in here. You can control yourself, and anytime you want to change the world, you need to be able to change yourself first. Any learned ability, for example, requires an ego that can command the body, and then slowly the unconscious mind will cooperate. Through muscle memory, you can learn a new skill, but in order to learn a new skill and to train, you need an ego that can command your body to do something that it's not used to doing. And you need to be able to subdue and restrain your more impulsive side. This is the contrast between the dragon, which presents itself as like this very unruly, chaotic force, which is directly opposed to the ego, and is almost overpowering, and the horse. These images are often contrasted with each other in mythology, but the horse is almost like the opposite, where it's the unconscious, but it's the unconscious in a cooperative manner, where it's become our friend rather than being something that opposes us. And this characterizes the state where the ego, by struggling against the body, eventually gets the body to be on its side. So you struggle against yourself in order to learn a very difficult skill, but eventually your muscle memory will retain that skill, and the unconscious becomes cooperative rather than, a hindrance to you. So your ego is immensely powerful and capable of a lot, but I've always had this feeling that people weren't living up to their full potential. Like, they could do more if they could kind of get a handle of their psyche, but they weren't actually living up to their full potential. I have this feeling that many of us feel very debilitated and weak, when in reality we have so much more power than we realize. And I mean that seriously. We each possess like a godlike amount of power, which most of us fail to capitalize on, even myself. I feel that most of us fail to kind of use our psychological gifts in the optimal manner. But we need heroes, because without heroes, the world becomes kind of despiritualized, and we fall into this kind of dreamlike state where the strongest wills end up dictating what happens to the rest of us. And everyone, I think, wants to change the world for the better. We can all picture a better world that we can all bring about. And sometimes it can feel like we're stuck with the world we have. But this isn't actually the case. Through an immense amount of effort and will, we can change the world and make it better. We have, in fact, been doing so for the better part of history, but we can go even further. Now, obviously, not everyone agrees with what constitutes a better world, and we should probably have long philosophical discussions about what constitutes a better world and find some consensus. But again, if you can't change the world, you can at least change the world around you. You can change your own circumstances to benefit yourself and potentially even benefit the people you love. And we each underestimate the power that we really have. Just think about it. I can use my ego to move around my hands. I can use my mind to control matter, literally. It's actually kind of absurd if you think about it. The fact that my mind can control matter, it really shows how powerful the ego really is. And this is why you are the chosen one, because your ego, can control your body. You can control matter, and thereby you have an extraordinary amount of power in the world. And through this, you can accomplish a lot. Yes, you may not be the one to save the world. You're probably not going to carry the ring to Mount Doom or, kill Voldemort. But that doesn't mean you should surrender your power and kind of regress to this debilitated state. You should use your power to make the world a better place, even if it starts small. Even if it just starts with your immediate environment. If there are things in your environment that you can change for the better, change them. Don't feel powerless. In fact, you should utilize the power you have. Are you frustrated with the people around you and the way they're treating you? You have the capacity to change that. Do you feel like you can't rely on your government? You can at least develop the skills so that you can rely on yourself, so that you don't have to depend on other people should things go badly. You can make it through a crisis if you can use your power to overcome whatever challenges you face. Don't give up. Don't just surrender to the will of the universe. Heroism isn't easy, and it probably sounds stressful, but it's definitely worth it. So if there's something that you've always wanted to accomplish, but you were being held back by fear, for instance, understand that you are in possession of a tool that gives you so much more power than you probably realize. And now that you realize it, please use that power responsibly. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed my rambling speech. I will be discussing this a lot more on our Discord server, so if you want to join, that would be really awesome. I'd really appreciate the support. But anyways, thanks a lot. I hope you have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.